So, welcome to Notes 5.3 for U.S. History. This is other groups that joined the fight for civil rights. Now, as you notice, we skipped 5.2 online because 5.2 goes along with your civil rights storybooks that we did in class, or doing in class, depending on when you're listening to these. And so we'll follow up with that, and that material will be in 5.2, which we'll actually cover in class. So we're going to look at some other groups that are not African American groups that are involved in the civil rights movements. And the first group that we're going to look at is women in the women's movement. And in the 60s and 70s, so we're looking at the women's movement. In the 60s and 70s, many women, many people link the struggle of African Americans for equal opportunity and equal rights to women's struggle and fight for equality. And a lot of African American women also find this tie-in because they feel like just getting African American rights still means they're going to be missing out on some rights. And if we look at the history, we can go all the way back to the 1920s. We could go earlier than this, but we're going to go with a brief history here. In 1920, that's when Amendment 19 gave women the right to vote. In the 20s, remember, we had the flappers and the new more liberated women, more free women. In the 40s, early 40s, during World War II, women enter the workforce to help with the war. Remember Rosie the Riveter? In the 1950s, though, women returned to the home to raise their families and support their husband that way. So, and then in the 60s and 70s, we see the feminist movement begin. And so the first thing we need to do is understand what is feminism and what does that mean? Because that's really what the women's movement of the 60s and 70s, that's what we're talking about. So feminism is the theory of political, economic, and social equality. So if you think men and women should be equal, you believe in feminism. A feminist is someone who believes or acts on behalf of the theory of feminism. So we're looking at not some radical idea, and that's kind of why this is here. This is kind of sarcasm, irony. We're not looking at a radical idea. We're looking at the idea of equality between the genders. And so this is really started by this woman, Betty Friedan. And she fought for women's rights all the way up until she died. She started by writing the book, The Feminine Mystique. And in 1963, she published this book that really exposed that women in the 1950s and early 60s were not necessarily happy with their lives. They didn't necessarily want to be housewives taking care of their families and their children with nothing else. Many of them wanted careers or other opportunities. That's not to say none of them wanted to be housewives and take care of their families, but many of them felt like there was something missing. They wanted something more. Nobody had said this before. This was an entirely new idea that women wouldn't be happy just staying at home. And so this idea and this book then is credited with setting off the women's movement. So Betty Friedan is credited with starting the women's movement by writing The Feminine Mystique, and then women started talking about it. Because if you remember, under the 50s, you wouldn't want to be the one to complain and be different because that may have gotten you accused of being communist. So the 60s, it was a time where things could change. You could challenge the status quo, and that started. So Betty Friedan, along with 28 or 27 other women, established this group NOW in 1966. NOW stands for the National Organization for Women. It is a moderate feminist group that has the most successful record for women's rights in American history. Now, they have not been terribly successful. Excuse me. So they have not been terribly successful because when we look at women's rights and we look at equality, there are still many areas where there is not a lot of equality. And if we hop back, there are still some areas where we look at feminism as being a bad thing. And so you maybe even thought of feminism as a bad thing. So the women's movement has not been entirely successful. Today, women still make less money than men for the same jobs. Things like that are still in place. So while they did make a lot of strides forward since the 60s, there are still some areas where things are not equal. So their aim was to end sexual discrimination in basically any social situation, education, work, politics, religion, whatever it was. And they did succeed at the state level, getting several different things passed, some different laws about work, about pay, girls' programs in schools. So girls, if you play sports, those are because of NOW. So the fact that girls' sports get the same funding as boys' sports, things about hiring, all of that is thanks to NOW. So there are things that you appreciate today because of NOW, the National Organization for Women. So here we see some of those things. One thing we don't have today is this thing called the Equal Rights Amendment. It was proposed in the 70s. It was actually passed by Congress in the 70s. And so here we see equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It was passed by Congress. It did not get enough states supporting it to become an amendment. So in I believe it was 1983 or 7, I'd have to look that one up to be sure, it expired. And so the Equal Rights Amendment is not part of our Constitution because it did not get enough support from the states to pass. So another group that had some differing successes was Native Americans during this time. And Native Americans are perhaps one of the most repressed minority groups in the U.S. today. And if we look at the history of Native Americans, we know that the Native Americans have had a very rough history in the United States ever since colonization. So if we look at a very brief history, and again, very brief, it all fits on this page, immigrants took the Native people's lands. We closed the American West, and there was conflict between natives in the U.S., but really we ended that with the defeat of Geronimo and closing the American West. Most natives went to reservations to live if they wanted to hold on to their culture. If not, they basically had to become white. So in the Civil Rights Movement, Native Americans decide they want to fight for their rights, they want to fight for equality, and they want to fight for their heritage. So their fight's a little bit different than the others because they do have this history that they want to promote and fight for. And the group that really starts doing this is going to be the American Indian Movement, also known as AIM. So AIM, or the American Indian Movement, is formed in 1968 and by two Native Americans. They began the group by focusing on problems of Native Americans in cities. So Native Americans, if you lived on a reservation, you were destined to be poor. There were no jobs there. So Native Americans on reservations lived very destitute lives. So many Native Americans would move to cities, and they would move into neighborhoods together where they knew other people. But what started to happen is the children started to become white, and they started to lose their culture. And also, these neighborhoods were poor. So they started neighborhood patrols to keep the streets safe and monitor them. And they started survival schools, which was really about survival of the culture, teaching traditions and cultures to the people who had left the reservations so they weren't there to learn them anymore. So that's how they started. Then it broadens into this idea of fighting for legal rights of Native Americans, and eventually autonomy concerning issues of local government. So they want to be able to self-govern and basically say, you know what, the Native American lands, they get to make their own rules. They don't have to follow the U.S. rules. So they really wanted separated from the United States. They also eventually want control of the natural resources on reservation land and the return of lands that were illegally taken. So they start kind of upping their demands over time. And at first, very peaceful protests gain quite a bit of support. People see that and say, oh, okay, you know, some of this has a good reason and good backing to it, and we should listen to them. BIA, by the way, stands for Bureau of Indian Affairs. But then we start to see some pictures that maybe don't sit as well with Americans, and we start to see some actions by AIM that maybe don't sit quite as well with Americans. And so AIM starts to lose some support. They become a little bit more radical. In 1969, they take over Alcatraz. That's actually what this picture and this picture here are from. They take over Alcatraz to try to gain support. In 1973, they do the same sort of thing at Wounded Knee. This picture here, the men over here, these are actually federal agents that have been taken hostage. So we see some more radical actions that lose them support from the public. Not necessarily from other Native Americans, but from the public. And so AIM, not terribly successful. They are successful if we go in a long-term, over time in court cases, they do gain more rights and more control over their own materials and payment for land or land returned to them. So we see some successes there. The last group we want to talk about today is mentioned in this sign, Hispanic Americans. Mexican Americans, Latino Americans. So any of those names, we are talking about those groups. They were treated very similarly to blacks in the areas that they lived in. But I'm going to talk about three people in particular, these three people who fought quite a bit for Latino civil rights. First, we'll talk about Cesar Chavez, who is probably and arguably the most famous of the Latino civil rights leaders. Next, we'll talk about Dolores Huerta. And finally, we'll talk about Rodolfo Gonzalez. And as we get to those, you will understand why we're talking about each one. So let's start with Chavez, our most famous of our Latino civil rights leaders. Cesar Chavez is an American. He is born in Arizona. His family owns a farm, but they actually did not have enough money to pay the taxes on the farm, so it was foreclosed on. And they had to move to California to become migrant workers. So Chavez and his family are living in California. They're working as migrant workers. And he is unhappy with how field hands are being treated because many are illegal immigrants. Pay is very low. Working conditions are poor. Hours are very long. So all of these things that you're supposed to do and the ways you're supposed to treat workers that we went over first semester way back in August and September, the bad things are still happening for migrant farm workers. So Chavez actually organizes the field hands into a union called the United Farm Workers, the UFW. And this group is the first union for farm workers, and they fight to improve working conditions, pay, days, working hours, all kinds of things for this group. So Chavez really fights for this. The first piece they're fighting on is actually grapes. So we look at that. So they want to boycott grapes. They actually push for boycotts and things so that the consumers will help support the farm workers by not buying these products. I really like this quote by him though. So right here, the fight is never about the grapes or lettuce. It's always about people. So he's really fighting for fair treatment of workers. He doesn't care about the food and how much it costs and all of that. It's about the people. So that's Chavez fighting for workers' rights. So not so much rights out in the public, although there are people who fight for that. In fact, there is a court case even about schools and integrating schools, Hispanic schools with white schools. But Chavez is fighting for workers' rights, as is Dolores Huerta. So Dolores Huerta actually worked with Cesar Chavez to create the United Farm Workers. So she helped him create that. And she continued to fight for workers' rights and women's rights for her entire life up until she died about 15 years ago, maybe. And this is Dolores here. This is her here. Here she's actually, it's about child labor. I don't know if you can read that where you're at. This guy right here next to her is Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother. So very, very politically active, fighting for both workers' rights and for women's rights. Very aligned with now as well as the United Farm Workers and many other unions. And finally, our last Latino civil rights leader we want to talk about is Rodolfo Gonzalez. Now, Gonzalez, we're going to learn about Gonzalez because if you look right here, he was active in Denver, Colorado. So his big push, he's somebody who was right here, and his big push was pride and heritage, the Latino pride and heritage. So not so much about workers' rights, but about being proud of being Hispanic or Latino, and about your heritage, and not trying to change that. So his most famous work is actually a poem called I Am Joaquin. And I don't know if you guys have read that or not. We actually will look at it in class. So it really expresses pride in Latino culture, pride to be Latino, but it also addresses limitations placed on Latinos. So you're looking at both of those things in this poem, which is not very long, but that's what he's looking at and what he's promoting. He's saying that Latinos should be treated the same as whites, but they should also be proud of their different culture, their different heritage. So that's Rodolfo Gonzalez. And many of his ideas are actually adopted by students during this time period. And kind of promoting this equal treatment, but pride in your heritage, we start to see some civil rights protests. And the big ones I'm going to talk to you about are students protesting. So these are generally high school students. The big protests, the ones that get the most national attention and happen all over the country, start in Los Angeles. So where's that here? Start in Los Angeles, but kind of spread all over. They're upset about conditions of the schools. So they're crowded, run down, secondhand materials, high dropout rates, all those things that kind of make a bad school, and they're not getting better. So in March of 1968, 10,000 students walked out of Los Angeles schools. There are 5 Los Angeles schools that these students walked out of. And it was a peaceful walkout. They simply walked out, stood outside in protest. This got national attention. Students in other areas, including Denver, also then participated in school walkouts. So this became a big push for civil rights, a big way to promote the civil rights during this time period. And here we see some of the students walking out of schools. I think all of these pictures were taken from the Los Angeles ones. I couldn't find any from Denver. But you can see the students protesting, and they're protesting for a better education. And as we know, a better education will lead to better economic status, because of better jobs. And that economic status is going to lead to higher social status. So ultimately, they are going to have more equality if they have better schools. So this ends our notes 5.3. We'll talk about more of this in class.